Uh, Good afternoon, welcome. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to introduce this. I don't know if anyone's introducing me or what. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm being recorded. We have a small but enthusiastic audience because I don't know where you're watching this from, but in Delhi, New York, it's really hot today. So anyway, I'm Ray Lefevre. I'm the Bovina Town historian. I'm also the archivist at the Delaware County Historical Association. And I've been asked to give a talk about the anti-rent war in Delaware County. I am going to ask our audience here to please hold your questions till I finish my presentation. And with that, I will begin. And I'm going to begin in the summer of 1845. In Delaware County that summer, it's warm, it's dry, there's a drought. People are a little bit worried about the drought, including a gentleman named Matthew Griffin, who was a lawyer and merchant from Fleshman's, now called Fleshman's. It actually was called Griffin's Corners in his honor at some point. But he's a lawyer and merchant. And on August 8th, 1845, he writes in his diary, "Kept my bed till 7 o'clock after being up till 11 last night. The weather still continues dry and warm. Much complaint about the drought. Hay, however, yields much better than expected. The stalks are quite solid to the bottom." Griffin wasn't feeling very well, and he described a bit of what was ailing him. It was one of those lower intestinal things, so he doesn't go into a lot of detail, but a little bit, which I will not share here. He's been spending several days sitting at his desk. He reports, "I have just heard of the murder of Under Sheriff Steele." Sheriff Moore, Under Sheriff Steele, and Constable E.S. Edgerton proceeded to the town of Andes, where they have a sale of personal property for rent due. Moore went in the lot to drive up the cattle, and after meeting with considerable resistance from the Indians, succeeded in driving the cattle near the bars. When Edgerton and Steele rode through the bars and halted at this moment, the Indian chief ordered them to fire upon the horses. Edgerton's horse was shot in the breast and through the body. At this moment, a fire was made at Steele and his horse. Steele's horse was wounded and sprang forward, and at this instant, he was fired upon. 3 balls taking effect, 2 through his body, 1 through his arm. He lingered till 8 o'clock in the evening when he died. So Griffin is giving us about the earliest account we know of an incident that still resonates in Delaware County today: the shooting of Under Sheriff Osmond Steele, considered by some to be the climax of the anti-rent war. So what is this war, and how did it start? And who were these Indians that Griffin mentioned? You need to know the anti-rent war was not actually a war in the usual sense. It wasn't declared by a governing body. It was a tenants' revolt with a political component, and I will go into that. But we have to go back a little bit. At the end of the American Revolution, you would think many of the old feudal characteristics of property ownership would be gone. But in New York State, the system continued. Basically, a few landowners owned enormous tracts of land, collecting annual rents from the people farming it. These were called patents, and they dated back to colonial times in the early 18th century. And one of the biggest patents was the Hardenberg patent. It was granted by Queen Anne, this woman right here, to Johannes Hardenberg in 1708, after he had purchased the land 2 years earlier from the Esopus Indians for 60 pounds. The patent was about 2 million acres and covered parts of what is now Ulster, Greene, Orange, and Sullivan counties, and included about half of Delaware County, New York. You'll notice here that basically west of the West Branch of the Delaware River, which is right out here, there was a series of land grants including Goldsboro, Franklin, Charlotte, Bedlington, and Walton, which is where Walton got its name. The Hardenberg patent was east of the West Branch, and it was turned into multiple tracts known as Great Lots and divvied out to various landowners, and there were over 40 of these. Many tracts of the Hardenberg patent went all the way from here to the Hudson River. And it was rare that a landlord lived in these patents or even set foot in them. It's interesting to note that most of the anti-rent activity in Delaware County was connected to the Hardin. And the patent boundaries from the patents and the great lot numbers and the lot numbers that were created almost 300 years ago are still referenced in deeds today, which makes it a bit easier when you're trying to find where a particular property was, because it'll tell you what patent, what lot number, what great lot number. And this is the state DEC map that shows these in detail. And a copy of this hangs at the county clerk's office. So if you're there researching deeds and you find a reference, you can run right to the map. And it takes a little bit, you'll get it figured out, but it's a wonderful tool for finding where property was. The tenants who farmed on these lots had to pay an annual rent. Often it was a quantity of wheat, which was not easy to grow in Delaware County. It might also include something like 3 fat hens and a day of labor for the landlord each year. Sometimes the rent was in money. One of the frustrations is that though they were tenants and not owners, they still had to pay property tax on their farms. And any of the improvements that had to be made to the farm, the farmers had to pay for, not the landlord. This is an entry for a rent book for a gentleman named John Armstrong, who had a farm in the Montgomery tract of Great Lot 40, which runs Delhi, Bovina, Andes. And that you notice on there, it looks like it says doctor. That's not, it means debtor. So, and the terms is the thing I've circled on there, forever. It basically could not get out from under this thing. They could sell the lease, but then 25% of whatever they got for the lease had to go to the landlord. And that really ticked off some tenants. So the Montgomery tract had passed from Janet Livingston Montgomery to her brother, Edward Livingston, and then to her niece and Edward's daughter, Cora Livingston Barton. And Barton owned the tract at the time of the anti-rent war. This is the indenture between Edward Livingston and my 4 great-grandfather, William Miller. He had a farm in Bovina, and he took a lease out on it not long after he came to America in 1832. And here is the entry in the rent book, which we have at the Delaware County Historical Association, and it's recently gone online. We'll be publicizing that more when we get things sorted out. His rent was 16 bushels of wheat, 2 fowls, and 1 day's riding, which is that day of labor they had to give to the landlord. And it was leases like this that provided the fuel for the anti-rent war. And these leases were very similar throughout the Hardenberg patent, and they pretty much followed that same model and any of the patents on the west side of the West Branch of the Delaware. So the anti-rent war didn't start here. It started in the Helderbergs near Albany in 1839. The war was triggered by the born in New York City, and he was active politically. He served in state offices, he served in Congress. He was the 10th richest American in the United States at the time of his death. He was a lenient landlord, but his will directed that his heirs collect the outstanding rents that he had allowed to slide during the Depression in the 1830s. Now, these tenants kind of assumed that the rents would be forgiven on his death, and they could not make the payments that the heirs were demanding. They tried to get redress through the courts, and when that failed, they revolted. This was about the first mass meeting held on the issue of anti-rent in July 1839 in Berne, New York, in Albany County. And they had issued a declaration, quote, "We will take up the ball of the revolution, and where our fathers stopped it, and roll it to the final consummation of freedom and independence of the masses." And there's a gentleman named Smith Boughton, known in anti-rent circles as Big Thunder, who was an early leader of the movement in the Rensselaer area. And the tenants, on his encouragement, started a rent strike. They were not going to pay their rent, period. And there was a skirmish with a posse led by the Albany County Sheriff. So then the governor sent in the troops, basically, and the anti-renters surrendered. There was really no way they could fight that. And so the movement sort of went underground. And this is when, as it smoldered, they started creating secret societies. And this is when the Calico Indian disguises came into being. That's where the term Indian was used. They thought of themselves similar to the people disguised as Indians who dumped tea in the Boston Harbor in December 1773. The purpose of being in disguise was to protect their identities while preventing the auction of a farmer's personal possessions to cover the back rent. And it was a pretty effective disguise, as you will notice. They weren't really dressed like the stereotypical Indians. It was just interesting how they came up with that term. They wore full face masks, and the calico costumes, I think sometimes were just some woman's dress. They, you know, their mother, their girlfriend, their wife, whatever. And it would hide what they were wearing, and it made it easier to disguise so people wouldn't recognize who they were. But in the meantime, there were efforts to work within the system. Several attempts were made to change the law concerning tenants and perpetual leases with petitions to the legislature. A couple of times, legislative committees were actually convened to study this issue and provide some relief. But each time, agents of the landlords were able to stop any report from coming out. In 1844, a committee which had seemed sympathetic to the tenants after being influenced by the landlords, instead issued a stern denunciation of the anti-rent movement, claiming that the tenant hardships, quote, exist but in the imagination. Yes, not very nice. After that 1844 failure by the legislature, more anti-rent groups were formed, and the movement started spreading south into Columbia, Schoharie, Delaware, and Ulster counties. Reports came back to the Albany area as the movement grew in Delaware County. And have to keep in mind, almost all the newspapers that you can find nowadays, most of them were not supporting the anti-renters because the newspapers were mostly owned by people with a lot of money. So you'll see that in newspaper clippings. So here, there's a general sense of an alarm. As I say, the anti-rent movement in Delaware is increasing to an alarming degree. The tenants in this vicinity have been regaled with several lectures by itinerant orators of the down rent school. In the 1880 history of Delaware County, Munsell's 1880 history, there's a quote, "One who remembers the old times tells us he never seriously rebelled against the system under which he lived until its seeming injustice suddenly broke upon him after he had called to pay his rent to the representatives of the Hardenberg estate and found him living near New York in what appeared to him to be extravagant splendor on the proceeds of his tenants' toil among the mountains of Delaware." So that got him fired up. So here's a meeting that was held at Hunting Tavern in Andes of the Andes, Bovina, and Delhi Eco Rights Association in September 1844. And there was a meeting in Davenport about a month later. And while the political efforts to get the system changed continued, the Calico Indians stepped up their efforts to stop any attempt to sell a farmer's cattle, possessions, whatever, to cover the back rent. So when word got out about a particular sale being scheduled, the Indians would threaten the land agents, constables, and undersheriffs with tarring and feathering. This letter is threatening G.H. Edgerton, and it's at the Delaware County Historical Association, and we currently have it on exhibit. So we actually have it on display right now. There are several instances of these threats actually being carried out. This letter says in part, "You are requested not to meddle, plot, or plan with the landlords or their agents likewise to settle up all difficulties with tenants owning or occupying all such lands. Be assured that this warning is not for nothing. If tar and feather won't make you stop your robberies, a dose of pistol pills will take care of your disorder." It ends with, "Take care, the public feeling is against you." Now, if this threat didn't stop the sale, the next step was to prevent the auction itself from going ahead. And this is when the famous tin horn went into use. These horns are actually intended to call people working out in the field to house for lunch or dinner. But what they used them for here was to alert anti-renters if there was a sale being threatened someplace. They'd blow the horns, they'd get in their disguises and go running over. And they had a whole underground system. But I want you to hear, let's see if I can do this or not, what this sounded like. Are you okay there? That's pretty loud. I won't do it again, but it's pretty loud. So, and if nothing else, you wouldn't be late for dinner, right? In the fall of 1844, the landlord agent, Timothy Corbin, and Sheriff Moore served a warrant for non-payment of rent on Daniel Squires in Roxbury. Horns blew and the Indians rushed to Squires' farm, where they burned the sheriff's papers, and Corbin tried to escape. He was caught and he was tarred and feathered. And this incident really is kind of seen as the real firing up of the anti-rent movement in Delaware County. The state in early 1845 passed legislation that declared protesting in disguise illegal. And that law, until very, very, very recently, was still in effect. I think during COVID, they had to modify it. But if you remember the Occupy Wall Street protests back in around 2009, people were being arrested for being in disguise, and that's the law that they got arrested under. With this law to back them up, county officials ramped up the efforts to unmask and capture the Indians. And Under Sheriff Osmond Steele was particularly hard on the Indians and was very unpopular with them, and was considered by some people to be a bully. There were several altercations between Steele and the Calico Indians in March 1845. They accosted him after he had served papers notifying someone that there's going to be an auction selling their stuff, forced him to hide out at Hunting Tavern in Andes, and he managed to get a note smuggled out to Sheriff Moore, and the sheriff came from Delhi with all due speed with about 170 men to rescue Steele. And by the time they got to Andes, the Indians had dispersed because their network told them something was happening. So as the tensions in the county grew during that hot summer of 1845, a large crowd, said to have been around 5,000 people, gathered in Delhi on July 4th, 1845, to hear Erastus Root, who was a foe of the landlords, give an Independence Day speech. Root was a prominent political figure in Delaware County. He had been lieutenant governor at one point. He served in Congress. He served in the state legislature. He switched political affiliations in the 1830s, becoming a Whig. It's likely that's when he became an anti-renter. And given he was a lawyer, his stance was somewhat unusual. Most lawyers, including Matthew Griffin, landlords, feeling that the tenants should honor their contracts. In his address, Root declared, quote, "Franklin and Washington were great men. They broke the scepter of a great tyrant. Let us little folk try to break the scepters of little tyrants." Now, so the Calico Indians continued their efforts to stop the sales, and we come to August 7th, 1845, on Dingle Hill in the town of Andes. A sale was to be held on the Moses Earl farm, selling off his cattle and other possessions in order to collect the back rent he owed to the landlord, Charlotte Verplanck. As happened with many of these sales, the Calico Indians tried to disrupt it, and about 200 of them showed up on Dingle Hill that day. And Under Sheriff Steele came to enforce the sale, and the story is that he stopped at the Hunting Tavern in Andes for a drink or two, boasting that lead can't penetrate steel. And that is still on a sign in Andes today, I think. Whether he actually said this or not, I don't know, but it's possible. And so, as we already showed, as Griffin reported in his diary, Steele was shot in a volley of gunfire at the Moses Earl farm. And he was taken back to the tavern where he had made that boast earlier. And there's a story that says, as he was dying, he said to Moses Earl, "Old man, if you had paid your rent, I would not have been shot." And the farmer is supposed to have replied, If you had stayed home and mind your own business, you would not have been shot. Again, did he say that? I don't know. But the shooting of Steele took the wind out of the sails of the anti-renters. They were horrified and just panic-stricken. And so they scattered. The Calico Indians just scattered to the four corners of the earth. They went into hiding, and the costumes were buried or burnt. And the area was declared to be in a state of insurrection. The governor declared it so. And militia units went out far and wide and managed to arrest over 100 people for the murder. And remember our friend Timothy Corbin, who was tarred and feathered earlier? He managed to get at least 6 of them. So he got some of his revenge back on the people who had tarred and feathered him. This actually is a discharge from militia service for a gentleman named Richard Gibbs. We have this at the County Historical Association. He served until, because the state of insurrection was lifted about the end of 1845, once the trials were done and all the men had been sent off to prison. It took over a month to capture most of the Indians. This is an article from a paper in Elmira, New York, in August 28, 1845, and was reporting on the posses. And I found this interesting because it pointed out that certain towns were on one side of the issue and certain towns were on the other side of the issue. And it was mostly the ones in the West were up-rent towns. Like, no, you have to pay your rent. And that's where they got most of the people for their posses. The ones that were east of the West Branch, they were the down rent towns, and they weren't getting so many people to volunteer for the posses. And the news of the shooting went viral for 1845. It was in many papers in New York State. It was in papers outside of New York State, like this one from Massachusetts, and I recently found it in a Washington, D.C. newspaper. So the news was out and about, and mostly told in terms of how horrifying, that this happened. So the indictments of the anti-renters started in September. Here's a Schenectady paper reporting on this. And there was one man in the sale, Edward O'Connor, who he managed to evade capture for a little over a month. He got made for Pennsylvania, but then he backtracked to see his girlfriend. Then he headed down. He was going to head for Baltimore, and then he was going to send for her. And he was hoping he'd get work teaching music, and he was a noted singer, and send for her. But he only made it as far as Neversink in Sullivan County. He was doing clock repair in the beginning of October when he was captured, and he tried to bluff his way out, but quickly admitted, yes, I'm O'Connor. So the posse hauled him away as he sang anti-rent songs at their request. And there were a lot of anti-rent songs. The day after he was arrested, on October 3rd, he was thrown in one of the log jails specifically built at Delhi to handle the large number of prisoners under indictment for the murder of Steele. Those log jails would have been on the other side of the current courthouse, kind of that parking area between the courthouse and the village. That's where the log jails stood. Because if you look at this picture, the church there, I think that's the church that's still there. That later became the it was a senior meal center at one point. So not everyone believed to have been involved in the events on Dingle Hill was caught. Roxbury's Warren Scudder managed to evade capture for about 2 years. And in 1847, he came back to Roxbury because he wanted to see his family. And the first people who saw him in Roxbury tried to arrest him because there was still a reward on his head for his participation in the shooting of Steele. And he pulled out a gun and said, I just want to go see my family, and then I'll turn myself in. And he did. We don't really know what to do with him because it's been 2 years after. A lot of stuff happened, which you're going to learn about in a few minutes. They finally arrested him in 1848 because he went to an anti-rent meeting, and then they basically dropped the charges. They were like, we can't do anything with this. And you'll find out in a few minutes why that happened. But most of the Calico Indians who were on Dingle Hill, and probably some maybe that weren't so lucky. About 100 indictments were handed down concerning the shooting of Steele, ranging from murder to breaching the peace. The first conviction was Delhi's John Van Steenberg for murder. He was convicted in early October, and after they captured O'Connor, his trial led to a second murder conviction. And the judge sentenced O'Connor and Van Steenberg to hang on November 29th for murder. Van Steenberg wasn't allowed to say anything. O'Connor simply said, "I die innocent. Remember this, my friends." Moses Earl was sentenced to a long term in state prison at hard labor. And many others were sentenced to varying lengths of imprisonment. In the case of O'Connor and Van Steenberg, the jury petitioned the governor asking for clemency. They said, given the judge's instructions, they felt they had no other option but to give a verdict of guilty. The jury declared that nothing in the evidence presented convinced them that the defendants had anticipated, encouraged, or approbated in the killing of Steele. They said that they, quote, believed Van Steenberg and O'Connor had no murderous intent. And so O'Connor, while he's waiting to hang, wrote several letters out of jail, including this one. This is the tail end of the letter to his girlfriend's parents. It's a very moving letter. We don't have time to read the whole thing, but it's heartrending. But he ends it with, presented to my friends to preserve as a memorandum for him who died in his country's cause, November 29th, 1845, aged 26 years. Now, in the meantime, the governor, as well as getting the petition from the jury, got letters and petitions from others asking for commutation of the sentences to life in prison. Well, he took his time. Only 5 days before the scheduled date, he commuted the sentences of O'Connor and Van Steenberg to life in prison. They got the news on Sunday evening, the 23rd of November. They were due to hang on the 29th. And it was reported that they leaped around like madmen. They were so thrilled. Can't blame them, right? By the next morning, they were on their way to prison with a mounted guard of 40 men. O'Connor wrote to Providence Reverend Graham that the 6 weeks I was under the sentence of death was more punishment than I thought I ought to have had. He also made a plea to the anti-renters, saying, if you behave yourselves and say peace, peace, and do what you can to make peace, it will go better with. So O'Connor and Van Steenberg were sent to Sing Sing. The other prisoners, for some reason, were sent up to Clinton in the Adirondacks, the prison that's now Dannemora. I don't think it was called that then, but that's where they were sent. The shooting of Steele and the arrest of over 100 people looked like the death knell of the anti-rent movement. The issue of the antiquated rent system did not go away, however. In the New York Constitution of 1846, the patroon system, which was the system of patents and landlords and such, was abolished, and tenants' rights were added, though the leases themselves were not abolished. That was a sore point with the anti-renters. And the law was also written that no one could contest the landlord's right to having these massive estates. And this was a big disappointment to some of the anti-renters, because for some of them, it's like, no, we shouldn't have to buy this out or anything. What right do they have to have all this land? So in the elections in November of 1846, tenants' rights and the anti-rent movement were high on the list and impacted the election. John Young was supportive of the anti-rent movement, and he was elected governor. And anti-rent candidates also went out in county level elections, including sheriff. Sheriff Moore was voted out or didn't run again. I can't remember which it is. So January 1847, the new governor pardoned all the anti-rent prisoners, including granting back citizen rights, except for some reason, O'Connor, Van Steenberg, and Moses Earl didn't get their citizenship rights back, and neither did Smith Boughton. Remember I mentioned him earlier? He had gone to prison for a different incident, I think in Columbia County. Though later that year, he relented and they all got their citizenship rights back. The prisoners came home to large and enthusiastic welcomes. Our diarist, Matthew Griffin, he reported in his diary on January 1847 that he saw Edward O'Connor returning from Sing Sing. He noted that, quote, the anti-renters made quite a fuss upon his return. 'Tis even difficult to tell the effects which will result, whether beneficial or otherwise, of the pardons. And hopefully I mentioned this, but Griffin was not a supporter of the anti-rent movement. He thought they should have just paid their rents and kept their mouths shut. But the release of the prisoners, the change in the Constitution still didn't end the anti-rent movement. Anti-rent newspapers continued to be published for several years. This was one that was published in Delhi till the 1850s, and it's very hard to find copies of it. I haven't had much luck. If they are around, they're not online. And tenants continued to question the landlord's right to these huge estates. In July 1849, the New York Tribune reported on several anti-rent meetings in Delaware County, and a resolution was passed at a meeting in Bovina that read in part that we consider the tenants the only true possessors and that our possessions should never inure to the benefit of the landlord, who fraudulently imposes leases upon us. And that, in order to bring this cause speedily to an issue, we call upon those who have it in charge to forward the aforementioned suit as speedily as possible in order to determine us in our course and quiet the minds of so large a community. And the resolution went on to state, we, the injured, defrauded, and oppressed people, will wage perpetual warfare against that accursed system until it is eradicated root and branch, and call upon every well-wisher of society, every lover of liberty, and every officer wielding influence, either executive, legislature, or judicial, to aid us in the just cause we have commenced. So they were still going on that issue. But unfortunately, this major goal of basically questioning the landlord's rights, that was never accomplished. And because they couldn't question this, if they really wanted their farms, they were going to have to buy their farms. So they started doing that. But remember William Miller? His rent payments continued until 1854, when he was able to finally buy his farm. And that's not too long a time period. He probably had to save up money for a few years. And by this time, the landlords were kind of anxious to unload these lands, I think maybe just for how it looked, for political reasons. And so they were able to work out, or willing to work out, deals with the tenants to buy. But some of them were so anxious that they sold their lots to unscrupulous land agents, and this led to some farmers continuing to pay rent for decades. Scrolls that I've seen around, there were some people paying rents into the 20th century. So it was amazing how long that vestige lasted. So the key people involved in the shooting of Osmond Steele had varied lives when they were released from prison. Edward O'Connor, pictured here, the only known photograph of him, married and had 3 children. And his wife died about a decade later. This picture was taken, we think, not long after her death. And he ultimately moved to Michigan, where he died in 1863. That same year, Moses Earl died in poverty on his old farm. He had a very rough, it's a lot to go into, so I won't now, but I always feel bad for Moses because he kind of got caught up in this. He wasn't active in this. He just got kind of brought in. John Van Steenberg had a nervous breakdown, but he recovered. He continued to farm in Delhi, got married, raised a family of 9 children. And he died in 1884. And so for many years after the anti-rent war, it was not discussed around very much. There'd be passing references, but people were nervous about the topic. I think it's one of the reasons why many artifacts from the anti-rent war just don't exist. There are some around, and some amazing finds, usually found them like inside a wall of a house or something like that, because they were hiding them. The daughter of Edward O'Connor, when asked about the anti-rent war and her father's role in it, said, "We don't talk about those times." That's all she said. In Munsell's History of Delaware County in 1880, the author said that the so-called anti-rent war was one of the most striking episodes in the history of Delaware County. Yet it is not remembered with pleasure, nor pointed to with pride by any good citizen of the county. But interest in this tenants' rebellion began to grow in the 20th century. Here's a marker. It dates from 1832, and it's a mile from where the infamous shooting of Osmond Steele took place. So it's near Dingle Hill. And then in 1940, this mural was installed at the Delhi Post Office. So sometime, if you haven't gone in, you should go in and look. It was painted by a Woodstock artist named Mary Early, and it was funded under the Fine Arts section of the U.S. Treasury Department. She won a competition. There was a competition to put murals in 48 states, one for each state, because there are only 48, and each state got one post office, and for New York, they chose Delhi, and her painting won the competition. And she got $690 for doing the painting, which is, I calculated like $10,000, $15,000 a day. I mean, it's a good amount of money because this took her quite a while to do. So, and yet the issue was still touchy in 1940. The Delaware Republican, when reporting on the mural, noted that, quote, the painting depicts a famous, if unsavory, chapter of the history in Delaware. The virtual state of insurrection which followed have been often published in this newspaper and will not be repeated in these columns at this time. But the paper did admit that the anti-rent war was important and that it brought about the end of a feudal land system repugnant to American principles. And this is the painting about a week after it was installed. This photo is by Bob Wire, the Delhi photographer. And the Delhi postmaster really liked the painting. He sent a letter to the section of fine arts and said the mural has been very well received, with the exception of a few chronic cranks, which was to be expected. He went on to say, I am very well pleased with this mural, both as to subject matter and as to the portrayal of art. This mural truly and accurately displays the spirit of the era in Delaware County. That same year that the mural came out, John D. Monroe, who later became president when the Delaware County Historical Association was established, wrote a history of the anti-rent war in Delaware County. And it's really kind of just episodic little chapters, but it's really one of the first books written about it. And in 1945, Henry Chrisman's Tin Horns and Calico was published. And this was about the entire anti-rent war, starting up in the Helderbergs, and covers everything. And it's kind of the go-to book even today, even though the book is like over 80 years old now. That same year, Andes held a celebration to observe, and it's kind of weird, they held a celebration involving the shooting of the undersheriff, but they had a celebration in August 1945, marking the centennial of the shooting of Osmond Steele. And this marker was installed in 1966 and is on Route 10 just outside of Delhi. And I was a little embarrassed to realize I drive by that thing every day and didn't realize what it said. And then I also, when we were making the publicity for this event, the thing said the anti-rent wars. And I said, well, no, it's anti-rent war. But if you look at this, it says wars, has it in plural. Most of the references is anti-rent war, singular. But I now know where she got that, where she got that from, so I understand why it happened. During the nation's bicentennial celebration 50 years ago, Andes included a reenactment of the shooting of Steele. And I remember someone telling me they had a child with them, and the child was really upset when the sheriff got shot, and they actually had to get the actor who played the sheriff to come over to show that he was only acting and that he was alive. So the child was upset that the sheriff got shot. And then this article from 1982, Historical Mural Goes Unnoticed, I thought was an interesting article. And Postmaster John Bramer, in the article, noted that summer, the artist came to look at the painting. At that point, she was 82 years old. And so it was an interesting article. And then, so interest in the anti-rent war continues to wax and wane. And right now it's really waxing. There seems to be a lot more interest in it. And in 1997, Dorothy Kubik wrote A Free Soil, A Free People, The Anti-Rent War in Delaware County. The book came out. It's still very popular. And copies are available at the County Historical Association or through Purple Mountain Press. And her book was critical in helping me put this talk together. So I'm always going to be grateful to Dorothy for that. And this is the marker that dates from 2008, Middletown Historical Society, which is not quite what they call themselves now. So, and then last year, these Russian-born journalists, Victoria Kupchinesky and Misha Gutin, stumbled upon the story of the anti-rent war when we went to the Andes Community Day and saw there was a float about the Calico Indians and all that, and they became fascinated by that whole story. And they spent a decade creating this documentary film that is now, there are various showings of it. If you're interested in seeing it, just Google Calico Rebellion. It was shown in Walton last night, and I was asked to come, and we had a little panel discussion afterwards. But it's a very interesting film, and again, it just shows the interest, because I was filmed by at least one other documentary filmmaker who was trying to do a film on the topic. So the interest is of interest, and not just here. There's a lot of interest of it up in the Albany area where the whole thing kind of got started. And then last year, the Bovina Public Library got a grant from the Roxbury Arts Council to make people more aware of the anti-rent war and the mural at the post office. And we actually brought in some school children to see the mural. And this was a group from Andes, 4th graders. And they had, in the meantime, they had been learning about the anti-rent war and about the painting. So they come in and they were just so excited to see the painting. And it was wonderful to see these young kids excited about that and learning about this chapter of history, which some of us did not learn. I do remember 7th grade social studies, Miss Gordon, Granny Gordon, she did talk about the anti-rent war. It's the first time I'd ever heard about it. So, but you know, some people know about it and some don't. And so related to that, this postmark was created. The Delhi Postmasters actually really likes the mural and was very excited that we were helping to promote it. So, and I'm going to wrap up this talk. I wanted to use a quote from Dorothy Kubick's book, the conclusion in her book. I think she puts it very well. No memorial has ever been erected to the anti-renters. That some of them acted rashly and used extreme measures to gain attention to their cause should not discredit the cause itself. In cleansing the state of the last traces of a shackling system from the old world order, they helped to shape and define the democracy to which the young nation had committed itself. Then they passed on to use this precious jewel that we too might vigilantly guard it, not with locks and keys, but with fire in the hearts and spirits of each new generation. The anti-renters did what they had to do, carried out the mission assigned to them by destiny. We are in their debt. And with that, I am done with my formal talk. Are there any questions? Thank you. And actually, for people who are online, we've got a decent turnout for what's a really hot day out, so. Well, yeah, so anyway, our audience here, do you have any questions? Oh, they can? Okay. Well, let's start with the folks who are here. Do you have a question?
Well, a while back, there was a cemetery tour, and the anti-rent war, you know, was brought up. And there was actually a guy there who I think was a descendant of Steele.
So we can all hear you?
I will repeat the question.
Oh,
And he was.
So don't make it too long, so.
Yeah, he was kind of making it sound like he was on the other side of the issue.
What he's commenting on is he met someone who said they were a descendant of someone who was involved in the anti-rent war, but you're saying on the other side of the issue. And of course there would be. Actually, I look at the picture of my 4 great-grandfather. He never got involved in the anti-rent movement. I think partly because he was a dour Scotsman, and he kind of thought, yeah, you had to follow the law. So if he ever got involved, I can't see it. I've seen a couple cases. I've seen people going, yeah, I'm related to that person, and they were involved in the movement. But I'll tell you that and I think part of it also is you kind of have to accept. It's interesting when you talk to a woman named Marianne Greenfield. Yeah. She's descended from someone on there, and she just, you know, she doesn't really like Sheriff Steele, and I don't really like him either. But we have to recognize the fact that in the course of carrying out his duties, he killed, and that really just is. And so that's always the issue with this. Remember, there was, oh God, about 20 years ago. Andes, you know, one of the signs going in, they put up the town that shot the sheriff, and they got all kinds of, they had to take the sign down. People were like, no. So that's why they just did. They have lead can't penetrate steel. But because yeah, that was thought they were pushing it a little too far with that. And so it's, that's why I said it's kind of interesting. You say, well, they celebrated. You're celebrating something that really was a tragedy because, the sheriff was killed. A lot of these people ended up in prison. The poor guy who owned the farm, there's another whole level of story there because it was basically his stepdaughter who convinced him not to pay his taxes because he could have done it. And she says, no, you shouldn't do it. And she took his wallet and stuck it down her bodice. And and that's another whole involved story. But so I particularly feel bad for Moses Earl because I don't think he ever really recovered from, he was in prison doing hard labor for a while. And of course he got out, but I don't think he ever totally recovered. And it was really sad. So, yes.
Yeah, hi, I have a question about this. Fascinating, I had no idea that this is our history. But I kind of wonder if the laws must have changed because only one person shot the sheriff.
But they don't know what person.
Yeah. Oh, they don't.
Oh, yeah, that was the problem because you have to remember everyone there was in disguise. That's the reason in the end, I think they threw out all the convictions because they realized we don't know who shot the sheriff. There was in later life, there were a couple of people who like on deathbeds or something, or in later life said, well, I think it was so-and-so or so-and-so. But there's no evidence because whoever was shooting at the sheriff was in disguise. And my feeling is, one of the things I noticed when I was watching the film last night, you look at these masks, I don't know how they can see out very well. To be honest, if they were trying, I think they were trying to shoot the horse out from under the sheriff and they hit the sheriff by mistake because these are not going to be accurate rifles. They're just shotguns and they're trying to shoot them looking through slits in a mask. And so I think I agree. There was no intention of killing the sheriff. I think it was an accident. He still died. He still was killed. And I think that's kind of where, in the end, they realized we don't know, and that'll never be discovered because that secret went to someone's grave. Yes. That's so.
I could raise a technical point there. The firearms of the time were one shot, right? And it took about 30 seconds to reload. So if you had 3 shots in rapid, you figure that probably had it.
Well, and because I mentioned Griffin said Steele was shot 3 times,
Yeah.
and I agree that it probably wasn't one person.
Right.
Because but I still think they were trying to shoot the horse, and they hit Steele instead. You had a question.
I'm curious if you know what was particular about New York's land system with the patents that distinguished it from other northeast states.
That's been a curiosity because New York stood out in keeping that system. And one of the people who was kind of involved in a lot of that was Alexander Hamilton, because he had married into a landowning family, the Schuylers. And I think it was Alexander Hamilton that kind of made that push to not eliminate that system, because he wanted his, aristocratic friends to continue to have, all this land and be wealthy and sit on their butts all day. I mean, I know that's making it awful simplistic, but I actually think, and I've seen this in a couple of different histories, that one of the key players behind New York keeping that system may have been Alexander Hamilton, because, as I said, he was married to a Schuyler. So, yes.
I'm just curious if the Broadlands estate, which is still very much intact, and there were a number of tenant farmers on that, did they have any role in any of this?
Yes. Now you have to remember the Gary estate itself was the estate that the landlord lived on, which was kind of a rarity. So there were no real tenants right there, but the people who had that owned a lot of what was Great Lot 39. And I think some of their, excuse me?
What's the name of the estate?
It's the Gary estate. The Garys are descended from the Livingstons, and the Livingstons owned a lot of this area. They owned several of those tracts. The Montgomery tract, she was a Livingston. And then there was Edward Livingston. And trying to think of who else there was. But yeah, so they were one of the few people that were kind of living on the estate. And they did, if I remember right, there was a barn burned on that property when the Livingstons had it. That was, they think, was tied to the whole anti-rent war upset. So yeah, if I've never really sat down to look at, well, what farmers did revolt. It'd be an interesting project to do, but I know that they had to deal with the fact that some of their tenants, I'm sure, were fighting against paying the rents, and that's why, and then so there were a couple of times a barn burned, and then they finally kind of realized, barns burned back then quite easily. And a couple of times they're like, yeah, something, the barn burned naturally. It was not arson. So, but every time a barn burned, they assumed first, well, it has to be arson because of the anti-renters. So do we have any other questions? We've got about maybe 5 minutes. Yes.
Yeah, that presentation mentioned that there was over 100 people arrested. Did they, what's the sense of it? Did they just go around and grab every farmer who's
No, I think they sort of knew what they were looking for, but I will agree. Part of the problem was they were disguised, but I think they also kind of knew they had been, battling these Indians for months. And I think they kind of knew through various networks who some of the people were. So that's always an interesting question. Did everyone they arrest, were they all on Dingle Hill?
Right.
There was testimony from Edward O'Connor's neighbor that O'Connor was not at Dingle Hill that day. It was kind of weird because a few months before, he had a legal dispute with this neighbor. So I'm kind of thinking, God, this is interesting that he's actually sticking up for him, even though they had this, legal dispute. It was over a dead lamb or something like that. So that, I think that's the other issue in terms of why the governor had to pardon. And I mentioned Warren Scudder. He never got captured. He ultimately ended up turning himself in. And then by that time, because they had, basically pardoned all the prisoners, they're like, what are we going to do with this guy? They actually arrested him. And they're like, we're just going to throw this out because everyone else got pardoned, So, and so I think he would, and I'm sure some of them admitted that they were there. And it was just some of the testimony was very conflicting. And again, because they're kind of, well, I think I kind of recognize the gun. Well, I don't know. These guns aren't going to look that unique. So, but I think that's a valid point. I think they didn't just really randomly. They seemed to have certain names and people in mind. I often wondered about why they chose Van Steenberg and O'Connor to hang. And I think it was partly like, okay, we need to hang a couple of people. But I also think they probably had enough involvement in the movement. I mean, O'Connor, they knew was involved with the anti-renters to go ahead and say, okay, so we're gonna pick two of you. Yeah. Yeah, that's the whole thing with, they had all these indictments and, and all this testimony and all that. There were some people after they brought them in and had them in a while, they let them go. There was one young man, because he was 16, they just decided he's too young and they let him go. So there were some people who were just released, but not very many, but some were. So, but that was the whole challenge. And I think, again, that's why in the end, common sense was that, yeah, we have to pardon these people because we don't know if we got the right ones or not, so.
Who was the Calico? I've never heard of the Calico Indian.
That's the term they use for the men going in disguise, wearing the mask.
They're Indian.
No, they were not Indians.
There was a guy.
They were using that term like the Boston Tea Party people did when they were dumping the tea. They disguised themselves as Indians. I think they tried to disguise themselves in terms of what they thought Indians looked like. No tribe that looks like that. That's just someone said, I never heard of that tribe. Well, because there is no such tribe. That's just the term that got used. And the newspapers generally usually just said Indians. That was the term they used. But when they were using Indians in that context, they meant the anti-renters, and specifically the anti-renters who were trying to stop these sales. Because there were anti-renters who were just going through the legal channels. They weren't trying to do anything, as horrible. So, as shooting someone. So, well, I'm going to close up here just so you can see, this is the upcoming schedule of these talks that's going on every Friday in July. Diane Galusha will be talking about the reservoirs in the New York City water system. And then Colin Miller on the 17th is going to be talking about baseball. And July 24th, Cornell Cooperative Extension is going to talk about agriculture. And the Colchester Historical Society, and I'm thinking that's going to be Kay Parisi Hempel, is going to be talking about the Delaware County and the American Revolution. So with that, thank you very much for coming in and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too, thank you.
Thank you
Yep.
so much.
I survived this.
How long did it take?